Something happened to your mind early in life that most people will never experience. You developed a way of seeing reality that operates on frequencies others can't tune into. While the world around you processes experience through a single clear channel, you're receiving multiple transmissions simultaneously, and nobody warned you about the cost of that gift. Carl Jung spent decades studying individuals who carried this particular form of consciousness, and what he discovered explains why you've always felt fundamentally different from everyone around you. Jung observed that certain individuals possess an innate capacity to process reality through multiple psychological dimensions at once. They're simultaneously aware of the surface narrative of social interaction, the underlying archetypal patterns, the symbolic meanings, the collective undercurrents, and their own internal psychological processes. Most people operate comfortably within 1 or 2 dimensions, but you're navigating 5 or 6 simultaneously, and nobody prepared you for the cognitive and emotional cost of that gift. Throughout his therapeutic practice, Jung documented patients who described feeling fundamentally alienated, not because they were disconnected from reality, but because they were connected to too much of it. One individual described perpetual psychological vertigo. They could observe themselves having an emotion, recognize the archetypal pattern underlying it, understand how their personal history shaped their response, perceive how others were unconsciously reacting to their energy, and simultaneously maintain awareness of the collective psychological dynamics in the room. All of this happened in real time, during ordinary conversation. The exhaustion was profound. Your system is constantly processing, integrating, making connections that others simply don't see. And here's the cruel irony Jung identified. The very mechanism that allows you to perceive depth makes surface-level existence feel suffocating and false. Most psychology content completely misses this reality. They'll talk about overthinking or anxiety or sensitivity, but they're not addressing the fundamental architecture of your consciousness. You're not broken. You're operating with expanded perceptual bandwidth, navigating a world designed for single-channel consciousness. Jung noticed that multidimensional awareness wasn't randomly distributed. It appeared most frequently in individuals who had undergone significant early psychological development, often through challenging circumstances that forced them to develop complex adaptive strategies. A child who needed to simultaneously track their parents' emotional state, manage their own safety, maintain social appearances, and process their internal experience would naturally develop multi-layered consciousness as a survival mechanism. But that survival mechanism doesn't turn off when the danger passes. It becomes your default operating system. You've built neural pathways that automatically process experience through multiple frameworks simultaneously. When someone speaks to you, you're reading their body language, detecting the emotional subtext, recognizing the archetypal patterns in their narrative, understanding how their story connects to collective themes, observing your own reactions, and maintaining awareness of the entire relational field. All of this happens automatically, beneath conscious control. Jung termed this condition the curse of Cassandra consciousness. In Greek mythology, Cassandra was given the gift of prophecy, but cursed so that no one would believe her warnings. Similarly, individuals with multidimensional awareness can perceive psychological realities that others cannot see, but they lack a shared language to communicate those perceptions. One of Jung's most profound observations was that this form of consciousness creates a unique type of existential loneliness. You're not lonely because you lack connection. You're lonely because the depth at which you experience connection is inaccessible to most people. Someone might think you're having a pleasant conversation while you're simultaneously aware of the defensive patterns they're enacting, the childhood wounds driving their behavior, the ways they're unconsciously manipulating the interaction, and the profound sadness beneath their social persona. This creates what Jung called the problem of authentic response. Do you respond to the surface level where most people operate, knowing that you're participating in social fiction, or do you respond to the deeper levels you perceive, risking overwhelming the other person and marking yourself as strange or intense? Most people with multidimensional awareness learn to toggle between levels, presenting different aspects depending on who they're with. But this constant code switching is psychologically depleting. People with multidimensional awareness often describe feeling like they're living in multiple realities simultaneously. There's the agreed-upon social reality, where people exchange pleasantries and maintain comfortable fictions. There's the psychological reality, where you can see the pain and unconscious patterns driving behavior. There's the archetypal reality, where you recognize timeless patterns playing out. There's the collective reality, where you sense broader cultural currents. And there's your own internal reality, where you're processing all of this while managing your own psychological content. The traditional therapeutic response to this experience has been pathologization. If you describe perceiving multiple levels of reality simultaneously, you risk being labeled with dissociative disorders or boundary problems. But Jung recognized something crucial. This isn't fractured consciousness. It's expanded consciousness that lacks integration and validation. The suffering doesn't come from the multidimensional awareness itself. It comes from three specific factors: the exhaustion of constant processing, the isolation of unshared perception, and the lack of permission to honor what you see. You've been taught to doubt your perceptions, to simplify your experience, to pretend you see less than you do. That self-betrayal is where the real damage occurs. Jung developed a framework for understanding how multidimensional awareness functions in the psyche. He identified what he called the observer function, a psychological mechanism that can step outside ordinary experience and witness from multiple vantage points simultaneously. In most people, this observer function operates intermittently. In individuals with multidimensional awareness, it's constantly active, creating a persistent meta-awareness that colors every experience. This constant observer function has profound implications for how you experience emotion. Most people are immersed in their feelings when they arise, but with multidimensional awareness, there's always a part of you watching yourself feel. You're angry, and you're simultaneously observing your anger, recognizing its origins, understanding its function, noticing how it's affecting your body, seeing how others are responding to it, and maintaining awareness of alternative perspectives. The emotion is real, but you can never fully lose yourself in it. Jung observed that patients with this consciousness structure described their emotional life as both more intense and more distant than others. More intense because they're feeling the emotion across multiple dimensions simultaneously. More distant because they can never fully merge with the experience. One patient described it as watching myself drown while simultaneously understanding the ocean's currents and remembering how to swim. This creates a unique relationship with authenticity. People often mistake emotional immersion for authenticity. They believe that being real means being completely absorbed in feeling without reflection. But multidimensional awareness reveals that authenticity can exist at multiple levels simultaneously. You can be genuinely feeling something while also observing that feeling, understanding its construction, and choosing how to express it. That's sophisticated emotional intelligence. However, this sophistication comes at a cost. Jung identified the fatigue of perpetual translation. You're constantly translating your multidimensional experience into single-dimension language that others can understand. Someone asks how you are, and you have to decide which level of reality to report from. Each conversation requires multiple translation decisions, and that translation work is invisible to others. This is why small talk feels so excruciating. You're being asked to operate at the most superficial level of consciousness, while simultaneously aware of all the deeper levels being ignored. It's like being a concert pianist who's only allowed to play chopsticks. You can do it, but it feels like a profound waste of your capacity. Jung made a critical observation about the development of multidimensional awareness in childhood. Children who developed this consciousness structure often did so in environments where they needed to track multiple levels of reality for survival. Perhaps they had a parent whose emotional state was unpredictable, requiring constant monitoring. Perhaps they experienced situations where the explicit message contradicted the implicit message, forcing them to develop sophisticated pattern recognition. In these situations, developing multidimensional awareness isn't optional. It's adaptive. The child who can simultaneously track their parents' mood, manage their own emotional state, maintain appropriate social behavior, and process their internal experience has a survival advantage. The problem emerges later, when this hypervigilant multi-layered processing becomes the default mode even in safe contexts. The multidimensional awareness doesn't diminish as you mature. Instead, it typically intensifies because your capacity for psychological sophistication increases. You recognize more patterns, understand more dynamics, perceive more layers. The bandwidth doesn't narrow, it expands. While most people's consciousness stabilizes into comfortable patterns, yours continues evolving and complexifying. You're perpetually integrating new levels of awareness, which means you're perpetually losing the ability to unsee what you've learned to see. Every psychological insight you gain, every pattern you recognize, every dynamic you understand becomes permanently integrated into your perceptual system. Jung worked extensively with individuals experiencing the weight of expanded seeing. They would describe feeling burdened not by their problems, but by their awareness of problems. They could see the dysfunction in their family system, the limiting patterns in their relationships, the cultural conditioning shaping their choices, the archetypal forces moving through their lives, and the existential questions underlying their daily activities. One of Jung's most powerful insights was recognizing that multidimensional awareness creates a unique relationship with truth. Most people can comfortably hold a single version of truth and defend it against contradictory information. But when you're perceiving multiple dimensions simultaneously, you're constantly aware of multiple valid truths existing in tension. The psychological truth and the social truth might contradict. The emotional truth and the rational truth might conflict. This doesn't make you relativistic. It makes you capable of holding complexity without collapsing it into false simplicity. But this capacity is cognitively demanding and socially alienating because most discourse requires you to choose a single position and defend it. You're being asked to pretend you only see one dimension when you actually see six. This is where many people with multidimensional awareness start believing something is wrong with them. They observe how easily others commit to single perspectives, how confidently people assert their viewpoint as the only valid interpretation, and they think, why can't I do that? Why do I always see the other side? But Jung recognized this wasn't a deficit. It was a different form of consciousness engaging with reality. The single-dimension thinker has clarity and certainty. The multidimensional thinker has comprehensiveness and nuance. Neither is superior. They're different cognitive strategies with different strengths and costs. The social implications of multidimensional awareness become particularly apparent in intimate relationships. Jung observed that individuals with expanded consciousness often experienced a painful paradox in their closest connections. They desperately wanted to be fully seen and understood, yet they were aware that complete transparency would likely overwhelm their partner. This created what he termed the intimacy dilemma of the psychologically complex. Consider the everyday experience of sharing your day with a partner. For someone with single-dimension consciousness, this might be a straightforward recounting of events and reactions. But with multidimensional awareness, you're simultaneously processing the events themselves, your emotional responses, the psychological patterns those responses reveal, how your partner is receiving your sharing, what their responses reveal about their psychological state, the relational dynamics being enacted, and the broader meaning of what you're discussing. How much of this do you share? Jung noted that patients with multidimensional awareness often described feeling like they were constantly editing themselves in relationships, not because they were being inauthentic, but because they were aware that downloading their complete experience would be incomprehensible or overwhelming. They learned to present simplified versions of their internal reality, carefully curated to be digestible. But this created a persistent gap between their lived experience and their shared experience. With multidimensional awareness, being understood would require someone to simultaneously track all the levels you're operating on. They'd need to recognize not just what you're feeling, but that you're feeling it while also observing yourself feel it, understanding its origins, seeing its patterns, managing its expression, and remaining aware of its impact on others. That level of understanding is extraordinarily rare. This rarity creates a particular form of relational loneliness that Jung found especially painful. You can be in a relationship, even a good relationship, and still feel fundamentally alone because the depth and complexity of your internal experience remains unshared. Your partner loves you, supports you, cares for you, but they're relating to a simplified version of who you are because the full version is too complex to communicate. This is why people with multidimensional awareness often feel most understood by therapists, certain artists, or others with similar consciousness structures. These connections offer rare moments where you don't have to edit, simplify, or translate. Someone else is operating at your level of complexity, tracking multiple dimensions simultaneously. Jung made a crucial distinction between loneliness and aloneness in the context of multidimensional awareness. Loneliness is the painful feeling that comes from lacking connection. Aloneness is the fundamental condition of perceiving reality in ways others don't. You can address loneliness through relationships. Aloneness is an existential condition that must be accepted rather than solved. This acceptance represents a critical developmental milestone. Many individuals with multidimensional awareness spend years trying to find someone who will fully understand them, hoping that perfect relationship will resolve their aloneness. But Jung recognized that this was a misguided quest. The aloneness isn't a problem to solve. It's a condition that accompanies expanded consciousness. The path forward isn't finding someone who perceives exactly as you do. It's learning to inhabit your unique perceptual reality without requiring external validation. This acceptance doesn't mean resignation or isolation. It means developing a relationship with your own consciousness that isn't dependent on others, mirroring it back to you. It means finding value in your capacity to perceive deeply, even when that perception isn't shared. It means building a life that honors your multidimensional nature, rather than constantly apologizing for it. Jung observed that individuals who successfully integrated their multidimensional awareness underwent a profound shift in how they related to others. They stopped trying to be fully understood and started appreciating partial connections. They recognized that someone could understand one dimension of their experience, even if they couldn't track all dimensions simultaneously. This allowed for genuine intimacy without the requirement of complete comprehension. If this is resonating deeply, if you're recognizing your own experience in these patterns, take a moment to subscribe or follow. What we're building here is a community of people who refuse to simplify themselves for others' comfort. You found a space where psychological complexity is honored rather than pathologized. The cultural dimension of multidimensional awareness deserves particular attention because it's where individual psychological experience intersects with collective dynamics. Jung recognized that every culture has an implicit contract about which levels of reality are acceptable to acknowledge publicly. Individuals with multidimensional awareness constantly bump against these cultural boundaries. In American culture specifically, there's a fascinating tension between individualism and conformity that affects how multidimensional awareness is received. The cultural narrative celebrates uniqueness and independent thinking, yet the social reality often punishes those who deviate too far from consensus consciousness. You're encouraged to be yourself, but only within acceptable parameters. Jung observed this particularly in his work with American patients. They would describe feeling pressure to appear optimistic, solution-oriented, and forward-moving even when they were simultaneously aware of tragic dimensions, systemic problems, and existential complexities. The cultural emphasis on positive thinking felt invalidating to those who couldn't ignore darker or more complex realities. The exhaustion many people with multidimensional awareness experience isn't just from processing multiple levels of personal reality. It's from constantly navigating the gap between their actual perception and culturally acceptable expression. Every social interaction requires a calculation. How much depth can I reveal without making others uncomfortable? How much simplification is required to maintain social acceptance? How much of my awareness must I conceal to avoid being labeled negative, intense, or weird? Jung termed this the exhaustion of perpetual self-editing, and he recognized it as one of the primary sources of fatigue for psychologically complex individuals. You're not tired from your work or your relationships. You're tired from the constant cognitive and emotional labor of translation, simplification, and concealment. Jung noticed that individuals with multidimensional awareness often felt more comfortable in cultures or subcultures that validated complexity, ambiguity, and depth. Artistic communities, academic environments, certain spiritual traditions, or therapeutic spaces offered permission to acknowledge multiple levels of reality simultaneously. But most people don't have the luxury of existing solely in these rare environments. You have to navigate mainstream culture, where psychological complexity is often treated with suspicion, where seeing multiple perspectives is interpreted as lacking conviction, where emotional depth is dismissed as overthinking. You're constantly code-switching between different cultural contexts, presenting different levels of your consciousness depending on the setting. Imagine you're at a social gathering. Someone makes a comment that you immediately recognize as problematic on multiple levels. It contains an unexamined assumption rooted in cultural conditioning. It reveals an unconscious bias they're not aware of expressing. It perpetuates a dynamic that's harmful to a group they don't realize they're referencing. And it's delivered with complete confidence, as if it's an obvious truth everyone shares. You have several options. You could address all the levels you perceive, but that would likely result in defensive reactions and being labeled oversensitive. You could address one level while ignoring others, but that feels like a half-truth. You could remain silent, but that feels like complicity and self-betrayal. Or you could make a gentle comment that attempts to introduce slight complexity without overwhelming the conversation. Most people with multidimensional awareness become masters at this fourth option. They learn to drop breadcrumbs of complexity into conversations, testing whether others will pick them up. This is emotional and cognitive labor that remains completely invisible to those around them. Jung made a profound observation about the long-term psychological impact of this constant navigation. He noticed that many individuals with multidimensional awareness developed what he called a divided consciousness. Part of them engaged with the world at the level others could meet them. Another part remained internally active, processing all the dimensions that couldn't be expressed. Consider three people observing the same interaction between a parent and child in a public space. Person 1 sees a parent managing their child's behavior. Person 2 sees that, plus recognizes the parent's stress and the child's dysregulation. But person 3, the one with multidimensional awareness, sees all of that plus the intergenerational trauma patterns being enacted. The cultural expectations shaping the parents' responses, the child's attachment needs, the collective judgment from observers affecting the interaction, and their own emotional reactions triggered by the scene. Person 3 isn't seeing more clearly than persons 1 and 2. They're seeing through more lenses simultaneously. This isn't superior or inferior. It's different, but it creates a fundamentally different lived experience. Their awareness is permanently expanded, and they must find ways to live with that expansion. Jung's work on the integration of multidimensional perception offers crucial guidance for those navigating this consciousness structure. He recognized that the goal wasn't to eliminate or simplify awareness, but to develop psychological structures capable of holding complexity without fragmentation. The first principle Jung emphasized was developing conscious acceptance of your psychological architecture. This meant moving beyond wishing you were different, simpler, or more like others. It required acknowledging that your multidimensional awareness wasn't chosen, but emerged from your particular developmental history. You didn't decide to perceive reality through multiple dimensions. That capacity formed in response to circumstances that required it. Conscious acceptance doesn't mean celebrating or preferring multidimensional awareness. It simply means recognizing it as your actual condition without judgment. Your preference doesn't change your reality, and resistance to your actual condition creates unnecessary suffering on top of whatever challenges the condition itself presents. Jung observed that many patients experienced profound relief when they stopped fighting their own consciousness structure. They'd spent years trying to simplify themselves, forcing their perception into narrower channels, attempting to unsee what they naturally saw. The relief came not from succeeding at simplification, but from surrendering the attempt and accepting their actual perceptual reality. The second principle involved developing what Jung called selective expression. This wasn't about inauthenticity or hiding yourself. It was about recognizing that not every perception needs external expression. You can see something true without having to speak it. You can perceive multiple dimensions without requiring others to acknowledge all of them. Many people with multidimensional awareness believe that authentic living requires expressing everything they perceive. They feel fraudulent when they simplify or selectively share, but Jung recognized this as a misunderstanding of authenticity. Being authentic doesn't mean being transparent about every layer of your experience. It means being honest about what you choose to share while respecting that some dimensions remain internal. Think of it like being multilingual. If you speak 5 languages, you don't need to demonstrate all 5 in every conversation. Similarly, you can authentically engage at one level of consciousness without betraying yourself by not expressing all levels simultaneously. Jung's third principle involved actively seeking and creating contexts that could hold greater complexity. While you can't require every relationship or environment to meet you at your full depth, you can deliberately cultivate some spaces where more dimensions of your experience are welcome. These complexity-honoring contexts serve as psychological pressure release valves. They're spaces where you can bring more of your full consciousness without translation or simplification. Jung observed that individuals with multidimensional awareness, who had at least a few such spaces in their lives, experienced significantly less overall exhaustion and isolation. The fourth principle Jung emphasized was developing the witness position. This involved cultivating a part of consciousness that could observe your own multidimensional awareness with compassion and curiosity rather than judgment. Instead of being frustrated by your inability to engage simply, you could witness that frustration with understanding. The witness position doesn't eliminate difficult feelings, but it creates psychological space around them. You're not just frustrated. You're aware of being frustrated, understanding where the frustration originates, recognizing its function, and choosing how to relate to it. Jung outlined specific practices for strengthening the witness position and integrating multidimensional awareness. The first practice involved daily reflection, where you consciously acknowledge what you're perceiving across different dimensions, not to analyze or change it, but simply to recognize it. This practice builds familiarity with your own consciousness patterns. The second practice involved what Jung called dimensional sorting. When you notice yourself overwhelmed by perceiving too much simultaneously, you can consciously acknowledge each dimension you're tracking and temporarily set some aside. This isn't repression, it's conscious prioritization. The third practice involved developing language for your multidimensional perception. Jung encouraged his patients to journal, create art, or find other expressive forms that could capture complexity without simplification. This wasn't for others to understand. It was for you to externalize your internal experience, creating a record of your consciousness that validated its reality even when others couldn't perceive it. Jung recognized that multidimensional awareness, properly integrated, could become a profound gift rather than a burden. Individuals who developed a conscious relationship with their expanded perception found they could access creative insights, psychological wisdom, and relational depth that others couldn't reach. The transformation Jung observed in patients who successfully integrated multidimensional awareness wasn't about becoming simpler or learning to perceive less. It was about developing the psychological strength and structure to carry expanded consciousness without being overwhelmed by it. This required building what he called a robust ego capable of holding multiplicity. Jung made a crucial distinction between ego strength and ego rigidity. A rigid ego insists on singular truth and defends against complexity. A strong ego can hold multiple truths in tension without collapsing into confusion or fragmentation. For individuals with multidimensional awareness, developing this strong, flexible ego was essential. This capacity develops gradually through practice and conscious cultivation. Each time you notice yourself perceiving multiple dimensions, acknowledge them without requiring resolution. You're building psychological muscles that can hold complexity rather than constantly trying to eliminate it. Jung also emphasized the importance of strategic simplification. This wasn't about dumbing yourself down or betraying your awareness. It was about recognizing that some situations genuinely require engagement at a single level and choosing to operate there without inner conflict. The key is making that choice consciously, rather than feeling like you're failing at being your authentic self. This practice of strategic simplification paradoxically allows for deeper engagement when complexity is appropriate. If you're not constantly depleting yourself by engaging every dimension in every situation, you have more capacity for deep, multidimensional engagement when it matters. The existential dimension of multidimensional awareness deserves particular attention because it's often where the deepest suffering lives. Jung observed that many individuals with expanded consciousness grappled with profound existential questions earlier and more persistently than others. They couldn't help but see the constructed nature of meaning, the inevitability of death, the randomness of suffering, and the ambiguity of purpose. This existential exposure required what Jung called personal myth-making. You had to construct meaning frameworks robust enough to hold the existential realities you perceived without collapsing into nihilism or despair. This wasn't about adopting someone else's belief system. It was about consciously building a personal philosophy that acknowledged difficulty while creating space for meaning, beauty, and purpose. Jung observed that individuals who engaged this process deliberately, rather than avoiding it, found greater peace with their multidimensional awareness. They weren't trying to unsee complexity. They were building lives that incorporated and honored it. Now we arrive at what Jung considered the ultimate integration challenge, moving from viewing multidimensional awareness as a burden to recognizing it as a calling. This didn't mean pretending it wasn't difficult or denying the real costs. It meant recognizing that your capacity to perceive multiple dimensions serves a function both personally and collectively. Personally, your multidimensional awareness allows you to understand yourself with exceptional depth. You can recognize your patterns, understand your motivations, see your psychological dynamics, and consciously evolve in ways that aren't available to those operating with simpler consciousness. Collectively, individuals with multidimensional awareness serve as bridges between different levels of reality. You can translate complex psychological truths into accessible language. You can see connections others miss. You can hold space for ambiguity and complexity in situations where others demand premature clarity. Jung observed a profound shift in patients who embraced this perspective. They stopped asking, "Why me? Why am I cursed with seeing so much?" and started asking, "Given that this is my consciousness structure, how do I want to use it? What becomes possible because of this awareness rather than despite it?" The final integration principle Jung emphasized was developing compassionate witnessing of collective consciousness. Once you recognize that most people operate with simpler perceptual structures, not by choice but by psychological architecture, you can release resentment about not being understood. They're not refusing to see what you see. They literally can't perceive those dimensions without significant development that may never occur for them. This recognition allows for genuine compassion rather than judgment. Someone operating with single-dimension consciousness isn't inferior or willfully ignorant. They're engaging reality through the perceptual apparatus they have. Just as you can't choose to perceive less, they can't simply choose to perceive more. Jung noticed that this compassion extended both directions. His patients became more compassionate toward others for their limited perception, and simultaneously more compassionate toward themselves for the burden of expanded perception. Both conditions involve challenges. Neither is objectively better. They're different ways of being human with different costs and gifts. The practical application of integrated multidimensional awareness looks different for each individual, but Jung identified consistent patterns. These individuals typically created lives with deliberate structure that honored their consciousness rather than fighting it. They built in regular solitude for processing the constant input they received. They cultivated a few deep relationships where greater complexity was welcome rather than many surface connections. They found work that utilized their capacity to perceive patterns and hold multiplicity. They also became discerning about where they directed their attention. Not every problem required their full multidimensional analysis. Not every conversation needed their deepest engagement. They learned to modulate their consciousness deliberately, engaging full awareness when valuable and appropriate, allowing simpler engagement when sufficient. Jung emphasized that this integration process wasn't linear or complete. You don't arrive at a final state where multidimensional awareness becomes effortless. New layers of perception continue emerging. But you develop increasing skill at navigating your consciousness, increasing acceptance of its nature, and increasing capacity to extract value from it while managing its costs. Jung observed that these individuals often moved from feeling like they were racing against time, trying to process everything they perceived, to recognizing that some perceptions could simply exist without immediate processing or resolution. You don't have to understand everything you notice. You can let some observations simply be, trusting that understanding will emerge when needed. This creates what Jung called psychological spaciousness within complexity. You're still perceiving multiple dimensions, but you're not compressed by the urgency to process, understand, or act on everything simultaneously. There's breathing room within your awareness. After everything we've explored together, you're probably starting to see patterns in your own life with new clarity. You're recognizing why certain situations drain you, why particular relationships feel satisfying while others leave you empty, why you've always felt slightly out of step with consensus reality. This recognition is the foundation for genuine integration rather than continued self-betrayal through simplification attempts. The journey forward involves conscious commitment to honoring your actual consciousness structure rather than the structure you wish you had or think you should have. It requires building life architecture that supports rather than fights your multidimensional awareness. It means finding or creating contexts where depth is welcome while accepting that not every context will offer that. Most critically, it requires releasing the fantasy that somewhere, someone, or some situation will finally allow you to relax completely into being fully understood across all dimensions. That complete recognition isn't coming from external sources. The peace you're seeking comes from internal acceptance, conscious integration, and deliberate creation of a life that honors your actual nature. Jung recognized this as profoundly difficult work because it requires surrendering comforting illusions about eventual rescue or discovery. Nobody is going to find you and say, "Finally, someone who perceives reality as I do." You might find people who understand more dimensions than most, and those connections are valuable. But the fundamental aloneness that accompanies unique consciousness must be befriended rather than solved. This befriending of your own consciousness becomes the foundation for everything else. When you're no longer at war with your perceptual reality, when you've stopped trying to contract awareness that can't be contracted, when you've released resentment about carrying complexity that others don't carry, genuine creativity and contribution become possible. Your multidimensional awareness transforms from a burden you carry into a capacity you steward. We've explored the architecture of multidimensional consciousness, its developmental origins, its relational implications, its cultural challenges, and most importantly, its integration possibilities. This isn't abstract theory, this is lived reality for those of you recognizing yourselves in these patterns. If this exploration resonated deeply, if you're feeling simultaneously validated and challenged, if you're recognizing both the difficulty and the potential in your consciousness structure, I need you to do 3 things. First, subscribe or follow this work, because we're building something rare here, a space that refuses to simplify psychological complexity for mass palatability. You deserve content that meets you at your actual depth. Second, share this with someone in your life who might recognize themselves in this framework. Chances are you know others carrying multidimensional awareness without validation or language for their experience. This could be the framework that helps them stop pathologizing themselves and start integrating consciously. Third, commit to one concrete action toward honoring your multidimensional awareness rather than fighting it. Maybe that's scheduling regular solitude for processing. Maybe it's reaching out to someone who engages at depth. Maybe it's starting a journal practice that captures complexity. Maybe it's simply acknowledging to yourself that you're not broken. You're operating with expanded bandwidth in a limited bandwidth world. The work of integration never finishes completely. but it becomes increasingly skillful with conscious practice. You're not trying to become someone else. You're learning to inhabit yourself more fully, carrying your particular consciousness with increasing grace rather than constant resistance. That's the path forward. That's the integration Jung pointed toward. And that's what becomes possible when you stop fighting your nature and start stewarding it consciously.